While we're talking about mass attacks, let's go back to Half Moon Bay and welcome in Michael Anestis, Executive Director of the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. Michael, the Los Angeles Times wrote an article detailing the major shootings. It asked the question, is this a copycat crime? Do you think that's a valid concern? Because we tend to see, or at least it feels like we see mass shootings in groups or handfuls. Is that a valid question to be asking right now?
It's a valid question, but it's one that's really difficult to answer. And it's also a tricky one because there are mass shootings like this so frequently that you could almost see all of them as copycat events. There's always one briefly preceded by another one.
What would you say is the major question we should be asking right now? Because people are clearly exhausted by this. And the young woman just spoke and said it's embarrassing when she goes to other countries and she gets questions about this problem. What is the question we should be asking that maybe we're not asking often enough?
Well, I think part of the issue in terms of finding the right question is putting everything into context. This is just one form of gun violence, and it actually accounts for a very small, maybe as small as 1%, the total of gun violence in this country. So the question is, what policies or what procedures do we need to have in place for this particular form of gun violence so that we can reduce the burden of that while also paying attention to all the other forms of gun violence that impact communities across the United States every day?
Yeah. So what's interesting is officials said this Half Moon Bay incident is also a case of workplace violence in terms of motive. Is violence, gun violence, more common among people who are familiar with one another than it is just for strangers?
Yeah, absolutely. You're far more likely to find these situations occurring where there is some sort of relationship between folks, and as your piece before our conversation stated, a sense that someone's been wronged by someone else, and so it's this is not typically something that happens at random, although it certainly can, right? And I think that's what instills so much fear in all of us because it can feel so random and feel
Right.
like it could happen anywhere.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to ask you. When you talk about why people do things like this, right? Is there a way to not have that conversation? As our storyteller was just saying, oftentimes people inject mental health into that conversation where it doesn't belong. What is the healthiest, most accurate way to have that conversation?
I think one, as you just said, is don't make this about mental health. Certainly, if someone commits a atrocity like this, they're not thriving mentally. They're undoubtedly having a hard time. But that's different than saying mental illness is the cause of this or blaming mental illness in general. All that really does is stigmatize an already marginalized population. So I would strongly encourage folks not to do that. And here's the other trickier one I'd encourage. The reality is most gun owners, I can't think of any gun owners who it would be an exception to this, don't want to see this happen either, right? So try
Right.
to avoid making this an us versus them conversation. Don't make every conversation about solving gun violence into something that feels tribal, because I think it's very difficult to make progress on any sort of issue when folks get entrenched into their camps. This is a complicated, difficult conversation to have that requires folks who might not be like minded to nonetheless have conversations together and work towards solutions.
Yeah, and I want to make sure, before we end this conversation, that we acknowledge that this happened to a community. The AAPI community had to endure this, whether or not that was his intent or not, right? So how does an incident like this impact a community that's already underrepresented and now has to be worried about being attacked in group settings?
I think it's sort of a traumatizing experience for anybody who shares that identity. I think it makes people carry a little bit of doubt or hypervigilance around with them with their head on a swivel, and that's difficult, as you said, when a community is already in some ways underrepresented or marginalized. And I think you see the same thing in the sort of day-to-day community violence that so disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities across the country. Right, you have communities already struggling in our country and underrepresented in so many services, having to bear the burden of such tragedies over and over and
Yeah.
over again.
Michael Anastas, thank you so much for your time and insight. I appreciate you.
Thank you.